Welcome to Around the Campfire, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jamie Sonley, Marketing Director here at Northwoods. Today, I have two special guests with me for our very first Around the Campfire episode to discuss everyone's favorite topic, website RFPs. We all know that both developing and responding to RFPs is sometimes a necessary evil for both the organizations that issue them and the service partners they're issued to. Here at Northwoods, we've seen a lot of RFPs during our more than 25-year history, and unfortunately, far too many that are ambiguous or lacking so much detail that it's virtually impossible for the organization that issued it to expect a realistic estimate, and equally as difficult for a potential partner like us to provide one. And that is not a great way to start out what will arguably be one of the most critical vendor relationships your company will ever have. So, our goal with this multi part series is to improve RFPs all around and make life easier and better for both the issuers and responders. So, a huge thank you to my guests today for joining me on this inaugural episode of Around the Campfire. Jim Brophy is the Group Director of Digital here at Northwoods, and J.R. Samples is our Regional Solutions Director. Both are highly seasoned pros who've seen literally hundreds, maybe even thousands of RFPs during their careers and know of what they speak. So thanks to both of you for helping to provide some clarity on this complicated topic. But before we dive into the details, we are huge fans of s'mores here at Northwoods, if you didn't know. It's our signature snack. So I'm curious to know, what type of chocolate do you prefer in your s'mores?
Oh, that's the easiest question that I'll probably get all day. It's obviously got to be dark chocolate.
Oh, I'm with you on that. Jim?
No, I'm sorry. Wrong answer. I'm going with, actually, it's more of a brand than it is a type. It's got to be a Reese's peanut butter cup.
Oh,
Mm.
ooh, that's a good one, actually.
Got to be
Hmm.
a Reese's cup.
Yeah, now I'm torn between the dark chocolate and the Reese's peanut butter cup. Okay,
Tell you
I'm going to
what,
be
we can
thinking
issue
about
an
that all day.
RFP. We can issue an RFP on what the best chocolate is for a s'more.
We could do that. We could do that. I like it.
Jim, I think I'm going to have to rethink our relationship.
Yeah, well, we keep this up. I'm already rethinking it. So thank you very much.
Oh my goodness. All right. Well, thank you for indulging me on the s'mores question. And so let's go ahead and dive in now that we've got the most important question, the s'mores one, out of the way. So I think a great place to start is with what is probably the biggest mistake that we see organizations make with their website RFPs, and that's not starting the RFP process early enough. So I'll throw this out to both of you. What are your recommendations on timelines, and what does a reasonable project timeline look like?
Jim, I think I'll kick this one off if I may. So I'm going to summarize it at a high level, and then we'll talk about some of the detail. But I would tell you that if we're to release an RFP today, it's still going to be spring of 2025 or even 2026, before your website is relaunched, redesigned, and relaunched. And that can kind of be shocking for people, particularly people who have a lot of pain and agony of their website today, and to think that they've got to wait another 12 to 18 months. But this is really what we're talking about in terms of starting the process early enough, because we've seen some excellent RFPs and we've also seen some not so excellent RFPs. And so that process in and of itself can be, 4 to 8 weeks. Then you have to allow time for vendor Q&A and vendor conference. And then there's the scoring of the responses, and then there's finalist interviews, and then there's selecting, an award winner, and then there's the contract, has to come after that, and then you can actually start. So from a high level, you really can't start soon enough.
I would agree with that, JR. A couple things to keep in mind, too. I mean, number one, typically a subject matter expert or a project sponsor in the digital space is going to go to procurement and say, hey, we need a website redesign. And they're going to be thinking of it in terms of, weeks, months, what have you, and not really considering the tasks that are wrapped up within each phase of this process. To wit, one of the most challenging things if you are doing user research, and you should be, is A, recruiting those candidates, B, scheduling those candidates, and C, doing follow-ups for focus groups and those types of things if you're doing a combination, one-on-one interviews and focus groups. Those take time. The other component to this is the decision making, because oftentimes we work with a core team and then a larger team, and then maybe even an executive team. And factoring all of those stakeholders within your timeline from soup to nuts is going to be vitally important. It's probably going to take, I don't know, between 30 and 40% longer than what you think.
One of the nuances that I think pointed out in many times is when there is a bidders conference, and then there's Q&A. Some people have bidders conferences. Most everybody has Q&A, but you have a strong opinion about that, as I believe.
Shocking. Yeah, no, I don't like bidder conferences. I don't think I've been to a single one that's been valuable in my entire career of doing this. Maybe one in that there was honest, transparent communication. But we've been to several in the last year, JR, and I can honestly tell you that it's been a colossal waste of time. And can you imagine getting, maybe in some cases, depending on the opportunity, 30, 40 potential, bidders. And all they're really doing is going around the horn and introducing each other. So you know who's now bidding against you. Are you likely to tip your hand with your line of questioning as to what your approach may be? Furthermore, the bidder conferences I've been to, they're just simply reading back the RFP and allowing people to ask questions, which can be taken care of in a Q&A period if the Q&A period is adequately scheduled for. I would start by walking through the RFP and allowing people to ask questions and not just respond by, well, tell us what you think, or, we'll take a look at what your process is. Be specific, and that's not just for the bidders conference. We'll get to more of that later.
Great.
Jim, do you think organizations who are holding those bidders conferences are getting something out of them? I understand what you're saying from the vendor point of view. What about from the organization point of view? Why do you believe they're holding those?
There could be a number of reasons why. Number one would be, they might have somebody in mind, which oftentimes is the case, but they do want to maybe do a chemistry check with some other people who are out there. Frankly, in other cases, it's required, maybe at the local or state level. And I've certainly seen that, and that's unfortunate, because typically they're not done well, and they're kind of going through the motions because they have to check off the box on the state requirement. So could be a lot of reasons why.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, let's talk about something that I know the two of you have a lot of thoughts on, which is website strategy. And Jim, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but one of the other mistakes we often see with RFPs is the omission of website strategy, which is a really big one, because we know that it's one thing to redesign your website, but it's another to do it very strategically to ensure that you're setting your organization up for the greatest chance of success. So what are some of your thoughts on the website strategy component of RFPs?
Oh, well, it's absolutely necessary. I mean, if you want to find out what you're doing, you've got to build a roadmap to get there. And I think it's not so much that people are omitting the strategies. What they want is a number for everything without the benefit of a strategy. So that's kind of the challenge, because you'll see that we want a fixed cost for you to be able to, develop, user pathways for 10 personas. And we have, candidates of maybe up to 4 or 5 CRMs we're considering, and we've got a marketing automation tool, but we're open to switching. I mean, all this ambiguity that's out there. And unless you can really dive deep and figure out from an agnostic point of view what it is you need to be done, what are your objectives, what are your KPIs, what do your users want, all of those types of things. If you can develop those and understand truly what it is that you want people to do, because at the end of the day, people care about 3 things. What do I want to do? Can I do it here at this website? And how do I do it? unless you've got all that figured out ahead of time, and then what are they going to be engaging with, you're not going to get accurate numbers, and you're not going to have a fair assessment of both what's really necessary and perhaps even the vendors who are wanting to work with you. So there's a lot to unpack with this question, but I'll let JR speak on it for a moment.
Well, the issue that I find is, it's kind of a pay me now, pay me later from a website strategy. And so I'm a big proponent of the pay me now. And by that, what I mean is we would recommend going through a website strategy as a precursor to the RFP. You go through a website strategy with its accompanying user research potentially and the outcomes of that in terms of sitemap, et cetera, which Jim, you might want to speak to. But, the amount of information that you have after a website strategy is critical to getting the best, most accurate RFP response that's possible. So, I'm a proponent of do it ahead of time and then take those results and put it in the RFP, as opposed to making it part of the RFP. And, what website strategy means to one organization, one bidder, may be entirely different than what website strategy would mean to Northwoods.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, everybody's kind of using the same terminology out there, but it can mean vastly different things across organizations. I think the important thing is, well, I'll give you an example to kind of illustrate a point. We had a public sector entity approach us about a year and a half ago, and because we give a lot of complimentary webinars and workshops, they had attended a few. One of them was around strategy, and they actually contacted us to say, hey, can you kind of help us craft an RFP for our websites? We have 3 or 4 of them that pertain to our district, and we'd like to be able to make sure we're putting out the right things in the wild. So I spoke with the project sponsor, and I convinced this person to consider the website strategy first and foremost before issuing the big kahuna RFP, because, we just don't know what we don't know. And to your point, JR, about the deliverables, a well done, well thought out strategy is you're gonna understand the content needs of your users. You're gonna understand the content if you're migrating to a different platform, what content is useful, what's not so useful, what content is missing, and we can map all that for you. You even get into sitemaps and navigation. You get into calls to action. You get into everything from an objective and KPI perspective. And then you also have use cases, which then help with either third-party identification or third-party integration, and sometimes both. Because they may want to know, hey, what CRM or ERP system should we be integrating with? I can't put all of that strategy, development, design, all of that into one big RFP until I know a lot more. So we were able to convince this public sector person to do strategy first, which they did, and that gave them a pretty complete roadmap then to follow up with a deeper, more technically sound and tighter RFP, which then people could really, compare apples to apples.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a really good segue into this issue of ambiguity, which is another mistake that we see a lot with RFPs, is they just don't have enough details in them that would allow us to provide a really accurate estimate. And so the organization ends up with wildly huge price estimates and ranges. And so I know you have seen a lot of ambiguity, and it kind of ties back to potentially not having a defined website strategy as well. But what are some of the things that you feel organizations can do to ensure that they're not creating so much ambiguity that they cannot get a good RFP response from vendors?
Like, for instance, I'll start with something we've recently seen that was really good. And that was a rubric that they developed around the requirements. And this was for a content management system RFP, not for necessarily an ecosystem or a website. But it was very thorough, very well thought out. It was almost like I don't have to write a table of contents right now for my statement of work, because they covered everything that they need to know. This was a fairly sophisticated buyer in this case, I would imagine, because this was very, very well done. So consider the flip side of that, or the polar opposite. We had one RFP that not only included strategy, design, development, everything that has to happen, but they also wanted digital marketing campaigns. I didn't know how many they wanted, what the campaigns were supposed to do, what the target audiences were. And then we asked in the Q&A part of the response period, what do you want to accomplish? Who's your target audience? What's the purpose of the campaign? We're trying to get, because obviously you have to come up with KPIs and costs and creative and messaging and all of that for campaigns. And the response back after the Q&A was essentially, well, we want to be able to recruit people.
Well, Jim, what you're also making some awareness around is the fact that the more we have to guess at what the bidder is asking for, or what the client is asking for, it really determines whether we're going to burn the hours, to respond or not. And the more ambiguous the RFP is on certain details, affect the quality, the quantity of responses that they'll receive, as well as the quality of responses. You had an example there a few moments ago on a RFP response, and in another one that I was working, the RFP, the bidders had price ranges for anywhere from $50,000 for the redesign up to $800,000 for the redesign. And you can see just from that how different organizations were making assumptions around what the client wanted, and the results, most likely because they actually didn't award in this RFP, it was, you can't quite say it was a complete waste of time, because there was some learning that took place at the end of that. But if we get RFPs, and most cases there's still no opportunity to talk directly to the client and get clear direction, we have to make a decision as to whether it's worth the investment of our time to respond to that RFP. And when you do the website strategy ahead of time and you have the details in it, it makes us easier for us to either say, hey, this isn't a fit, or this is a fit. But then when we have to start guessing at things, it becomes very difficult to try to put together a cohesive response.
Amen to that. I mean, I think that price range that you talked about is spot on in terms of the ambiguity and the interpretation. If you're seeing something like that, because a lot of these RFPs are a matter of public record, so they post the winning bid, they post everybody else who was out there. That's how you came across that information. And when you're seeing $50,000 to $850,000, wow, that's not good at all. I mean, there were several that were in kind of a narrower range, if I recall, from that list.
Right.
But they still had a tremendous tolerance in between them. We've seen some organizations actually have an RFP consultant, and we just served as an RFP consultant to a public sector entity, a rather large one. We just wrapped up that project about a month ago, where we helped objectively identify the platform for an entire website ecosystem. And because we have our own, and we know we have developers, and we've been in software for 25 years, plus all of our digital expertise and chops, we were uniquely qualified to evaluate, these 4 different vendors that they had. The advantage is that the strategy was just about complete by the time these vendors received the RFP. They had a lot of intel. They had a lot of discovery. They had a lot of findings, and they had that roadmap. It wasn't quite finished, but it was pretty good in terms of where it was on the continuum. So as the evaluator, we developed our scorecard. We, understood everything. And that's the other thing, which we'll get into maybe in part 2, our scorecards. But the point of this is that a consultant can help you narrow down the criteria for having apples to apples comparison.
Yep, that's a
Pause.
great point. I do want to double back to something that JR mentioned, which is not having, for organizations, not giving vendors the opportunity to have conversations with them, which is leading to some of that ambiguity. What are some more of your thoughts on that? Is that common? Do you see that often where organizations are not willing to have um, with you to clarify different pieces of the RFP, or just some thoughts on that would be interesting, I think.
I think that's why they think bidder conferences are valuable, because they then have that, permission, if you will, to talk to everybody at the same time, which in their mind levels the playing field, right? It's kind of just part of the sales process, Jamie, a little bit, because depending on the industry vertical you're in, whether it's higher education, whether it's government, whether it's something else, public sector, private sector, you're going to have a situation where, like, in our particular case, we focus on healthcare and manufacturing and consumer, and we have different markets. So we have different business development, processes and at work as we reach out to our prospects in our given field of expertise. A lot of people will say, we're going to have 3 finalists, or we're going to have 5 finalists, we're going to have 2 rounds of elimination, whatever. That's when you have the opportunity to talk to people. But that's where it really gets slippery, because unless you have a really good website strategy or discovery, and then you've got really good responses that are relatively similar, you could pick the 3 people you pick could run the gamut of capability. I mean, you're not getting the best 3 because everything else is so wide open.
So what are the biggest differences that you both see between RFPs that are coming from more public sector, government funded type organizations versus private sector? It sounds like on the public sector side, there's a lot more structure, a lot more process that needs to be followed versus organizations that are not government or public funded.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And there are differences that we see, especially in government, higher ed, those kinds of things. There are, very few federal, but there are some federal stipulation in some cases, depending on the vertical. Mainly it's state driven, and there's all kinds of and a lot of these are valid. I mean, there's minority owned businesses requirements, there's DEI requirements. These are all valid and very good reasons to try to level the playing field for a lot of companies that are out there, because you don't want to, the established big players always winning stuff to have a competitive edge. You do want to be able to kind of spread the wealth, and that's a philosophy. So, and as a company that responds to these types of things, we have to make the business determination: is it in our best interest, understanding that there is a lot of red tape, and there can be with those types of things. That being said, once you develop a competency and you develop a reputation for delivering quality work in this sector, you're invited to participate. And that's where we have come within the higher ed space. We are invited to participate because they know that we have that competency and that expertise. But it took us a long time to get there. It took us 2, 3, 4 years to get to that point within that particular vertical market. We've always been in the government sector, and we have a lot of clients. I think your body of work also speaks for yourself there. But the difference is you have to kind of let your work do the talking with the public sector. When you're talking about like regular corporations and regular business, there's all kinds of opportunity to talk to these people, perhaps, leading up to a window for an RFP. You also have a lot more referral business that you can capitalize on outside of the stringent nature of government-driven RFPs, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that does.
Jamie, I'm going to speak for a moment back to your question about talking to the client. What studies have shown that a digital marketing agency is typically, 8 to 12 people. And the digital marketing, of course, spans, Jim was referring to earlier, digital ad campaigns, and it can include branding, and it can include many different aspects. But you have to remember that a website is a technical entity, and have the advantage of having a very broad and deep staff. And so the questions that we would ask come out of our 25 years and over 1,000 website projects. And there's not a lot of other people that have that level of expertise and experience. And so many times, we're thinking about questions, that others, just wouldn't have the experience to ask for. And having that opportunity to dig deep with a client, a prospect that's going through an RFP process, can really, again, uncover things that would make a material difference to the outcome.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, JR. So it seems like it really would behoove organizations to have those conversations as much as they're able to within the parameters that they're beholden to for their RFP processes. So great point. Let's segue into talking a little bit about web platform, because this is also a question that comes up quite a lot amongst organizations that are issuing RFPs. So sometimes an organization will already have a particular platform, content management system, or they have a preference for one, which is completely understandable. But it seems like if they're open to exploring options and kind of leaving that platform decision until the website strategy is complete, that can actually give them a better end product. So what are your thoughts on platform decision making, whether that's upfront or after the fact when website strategy is complete?
Well, sometimes it's a binary choice. I mean, they have developers on staff, they've invested into an enterprise class, content management system. There's just no choice. That happens occasionally. There's already, an environment that has been there for quite some time. It's established that it would be more costly to replatform. To the point about a strategy, though, and this is why it's so vitally important, I can't tell you how many times we see we're currently on X platform, but are open to others. Okay, why? Right? So that's part of the strategy. The why is, why are we doing things? Why are we changing them? What's the business problem we're trying to solve, or many of the business problems? What do you need from a user experience perspective? What do you need from efficiency perspective? Understanding all of that is then going to lead to a proper scorecard or criteria by which to choose a platform which is best for them at the end of the day, right? And again, there's always, internal and external pressures. I got a guy, somebody's part of the Gartner Magic Quadrant. Oh, I hear they're good. There's all kinds of those types of influences. Without that proper data and strategy, though, how are you going to be driven to make the appropriate selection for your platform if it's not a binary choice?
I'll jump in. I think this, again, is a reason to consider a website strategy before the RFP, because the website strategy will, if you're truly agnostic about your platform, the website strategy is probably going to help you drive you to a certain platform. If there's no integrations, if there's no e-commerce, that may help you select a specific platform. But if there is a lot of databases you're accessing and pulling information from, and sometimes, and Jim, you might speak to this, is just the definition of an integration be pretty ambiguous coming from a client. But I think going back to that website strategy, if you put that up ahead of the whole RFP, it will help you know which platforms are probably best for your consideration.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And that's why, you definitely need to have that scorecard developed based on all the inputs that you can have in the data. The other thing I'd like to mention is that I see quite a bit, people that do not want a CMS that's proprietary. That's a very interesting statement. Every CMS is proprietary. Yeah, there may be more users, there may be a larger user base. Even WordPress, even though it's, considered open source with plugins and all that, there are custom themes everywhere, right? And we see quite often that people develop a custom theme to support something, and then either that developer moves on to another vendor or retires or is no longer available. And because it's a custom theme, They have the keys to the kingdom. They know how that thing operates. So, I mean, insisting on a non-proprietary CMS in this day and age is folly in my view. So again, let the strategy drive that to find out what you need in your CMS in terms of technology, security, features, functionality, flexibility, scalability. And once you have an understanding of what your needs are, then go out there and take a look. And if it winds up being WordPress, great. If it winds up being some other one, that's fine too. At least you've done your due diligence. And the other thing that I would say about platforms, just real quick, is that it's not just the platform, but it's the vendor who's doing the implementation. And make sure they have robust experience with the platform that is being recommended. Because if they've done it maybe a half a dozen times, I wouldn't necessarily classify that as expertise. That might be experience, but it's not expertise. So that's something else to be on the lookout for.
That's an excellent point. What about organizations that are locked into a particular platform? They've got a multi-year agreement, they can't get out of it. Is that the end of the world for these organizations that are, beholden to a particular platform?
I don't know if it's the end of the world. I mean, at the end of the day, it's software. I mean, anything is possible. It comes down to money and time. So if somebody is, locked in for another couple of years, that's fine. What I would recommend at that point then is as that anniversary or that sunset date approaches, start thinking about the website strategy ahead of time. Put heat maps on your website. Make sure your analytics are spiffed up and tracking the right things, because you want to have all that data so you can conduct a strategy then to kind of zero in on the right platform for you going forward. And don't sign 10-year contracts. Don't lock yourself in for that long, right? I mean, technology does change. We typically see 1, 2, 3-year contracts, sometimes a 5, but don't go longer than that, because, heck, the next Google may be, on the horizon.
Well, let's touch on one more point before we kind of wrap things up for part one. And it goes back to our initial discussion about timeline. And I know one of the things the thing that really impacts overall site launch, whether or not a client can launch their website on time, is content, or rather the lack thereof. So can both of you talk a little bit about how organizations can ensure that they're planning properly for content development needs and what they need to take into consideration there?
That's a great question. Oh man, because that definitely impacts timeline. In cooking, they always do the line that says never enough onions, right? Always more onions. I would equate that to content. Real estate, it's location, location, location. In website development or this type of a situation, it's content, content, content. Content is absolutely the number one deterrent to launching on time. That's why a strategy is so important. Your timeline for the overall build should not be done or completed or even assumed until the strategy is over with, because if it's done right, you'll understand what the content implications are for building a timeline. We just got done with a large public sector opportunity where they had, tens of thousands of pages, but the system's been up for years, and a lot of these pages aren't even, accessed anymore. They might even be archived. They're not live. So through our highly effective and thorough content strategy, we were able to boil down, 5-figure pages of content down to about 500 to 600 pages. And we have a plan now for that migration with deadlines. And we're also going to be able to impact some content design within the new custom layouts that we're going to be able to build for these folks that they love. So planning for content, absolutely spot on, Jamie, can be a huge deterrent to launching when you think you want to. You just really have to take a look at that thoroughly and effectively.
We recently experienced a case where the did an excellent job speaking to many of the details of the design and templates, and done user research they shared with us. We got a lot of detail about the integrations that were required, and that was in essence the RFP. But then we got into the finalists, and what bubbled up was the fact they had they had never considered who and what content that they were going to have on the website. And it threw a real monkey wrench into the whole process because there wasn't a clear understanding, and Jim spoke to it earlier, of what content is good and accurate, what content is good but needs to be updated, what content is missing, and then what content should be retired. And it just stopped the whole process in its tracks. And so again, there's a lot of moving pieces to a website redesign, but to Jim's point, content has to really be front and center, and there has to be a very clear plan of, who's owning the content and what the responsible parties are and detail around that.
Especially if there are multiple sources delivering content to the website user, right? You might have content coming in from the CRM or from a information management piece of software or an ERP. If you're having multiple sources of that data, you've really got to understand what that is, what the taxonomy is going to be for display, what the data schema is going to be, potentially either from the database or schema.org for proper, Google indexing. There's a lot of moving pieces that an experienced, consultant's going to be able to unpack for you. But adequate time has got to be allowed to do that and to look at that process.
Well, thank you so much, Jim and JR. This has been a really fantastic discussion, and thank you for sharing so many great tips and insights for organizations that really want to improve their website RFPs. So catch us in the coming weeks for part 2. There's more advice to come from Jim and JR. We'll dive into a few more of the common mistakes we see companies make with their website RFP processes. So thank you to everyone for joining us. And until next time, enjoy some s'mores, and we'll meet you around the campfire again soon. Thank you.